Hi everyone and welcome to the Allied Air Force Research Webinar for September. I would be obliged if you would turn off your cameras and sound until the presentation is over. It hopefully will stop any screens freezing, and it will also keep the background noise to a minimum so that everyone can enjoy the event as well. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Claire Wilson and I will be your host this evening. I'm a professional genealogist for Treehouse Genealogy, and I also run the Allied Air Force Research website. My own interest in all things Air Force stemmed from researching many of my own relatives' service, and I'm sure that might be the case for a lot of you as well. We are always happy to collaborate, so if you have a story to share with our audience, please get in touch. Alternatively, if you're struggling with your own research, feel free to reach out via the website, and I will post some details into the chat box for you. I know we have a couple of people watching on YouTube tonight, so hi if you're watching via that platform. So our speaker this evening is Captain Karl Kjarsgaard, a commercial airline pilot for over 35 years. He is now a serious restorer, historian and researcher of World War II aircraft, air combat and Canada's Royal Canadian Air Force history. Karl was trained post-war by former World War II combat pilots at a young age, becoming fascinated by their war stories. He continued his lifelong study of their excellence and sacrifice, gathering all information to honour these airmen's heritage and their combat aircraft. Now the curator at the Bomber Command Museum of Canada in Nanton, Alberta, he is recovering Halifax bombers from around the world, whilst rebuilding a Halifax for this internationally ranked memorial museum. Karl, it's so nice to have you tonight. Welcome.
Well, thanks, Claire, and I appreciate your interest and wanting to share this with the world. And we can talk about things with wings tonight and the history thereof, and maybe giving a lean to the Halifax aircraft, but certainly our bomber boys that are close to our hearts.
Yeah, definitely. So I will share the presentation. If anyone has any questions for Karl, you can ask them at the end. I'll just share my screen. Let me just move a couple of things about. Okay, you should see that now, Karl. I will mute and turn my video off, and if you need anything, just give me a shout.
And I will also stop my video, but we must keep the audio going. So we'll be able to start off our show. So Claire, I'll give you a shout when it's time to change the slides, and we'll progress through for everybody.
Yep, that's fine.
Yep, okay. And so welcome everyone, and it's my pleasure to share some history with you. Maybe we can pool our knowledge, learn more from each other. And I've been doing this for over 30 years. And little did I know that over 30 years ago, when I started attending bomber crew reunions, that it would lead me down this path. But can you imagine 30 years ago being able to talk to the lads that flew these bombers one-on-one when I was 40 and they were 70? And now, I'm not supposed to tell you, but now because I'm 70, it's amazing all of the knowledge that has come my way over the past few years. So beginning at Bomber Command was a major contribution on all fronts during the war. And as Bomber Command grew and got larger and larger as a force, it was amazing to see these developments. And one point in history that really stuck out for me was the raids on Duisburg on October 14, 15, 1944. They didn't go during that 24-hour period. They did not go to Duisburg once. They went twice. And this is, I couldn't believe it when I read about it, that they went early in the morning of October 14th and late in the afternoon on the same day. The same bombers, some of the same crews, and if you can imagine the double whammy of 2 heavy bomber raids. But I want to take you through Duisburg, and then what I'm trying to do is tell you where Canada fits into this. And it's a point of pride with me to be able to present this to you today. Now, I also, you notice at the bottom of the title, it says blame the Canadians. And we're going to get to these colonial mischief makers that are my heroes. Well, I guess all the bomber boys are our heroes. So let us go into October 14 and 15, 1944, and see what we can find. So next slide, Claire. Blighty was a, what would you call it, a newspaper of certain standard, I won't say what kind, during the war. And it was all over wherever the British and Commonwealth entities were. And I've discovered this poem out of Blighty in the book that Bill Carter wrote on his father and the RCAF and Bomber Command. And certainly it is Royal Air Force Bomber Command, but now we're going to find out about those Canadians in the number 6 RCAF Bomber Group. So next slide. So I will start you out with the beginnings of these mischief makers, most of them in Yorkshire, but all over at bomber bases, and I will read it with you. You can read along, but it is a wonderful poking fun at the Canadians. If your cat or dog has strayed from home, your cows at evening to milk not come, some say it's luck, but then some blame the Canadians. And you got to understand, in Yorkshire, things would disappear in the night. So if some things tend to disappear or noises in the night you hear, and you lock your door at night in fear, blame the Canadians. If cigarettes are all sold out and you cannot buy a pint of stout, some get mad and rave and shout and blame the Canadians. If you're missing some of your chickens and your ducks are gone to Dickens, don't give your dog no lickings, blame the Canadians. And there's more, but we have to get into history now instead of humor. So next slide, please, Claire. So let us go backwards in time to the beginning of the war. And they wanted, England and Canada wanted to be part of this Air Force massing the formations. And England wanted the RCAF Canadian crews graduating from the newly formed British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. They wanted them to go into the RAF squadrons when they were sent overseas to England or RAF bases in the Pacific. Mackenzie King, bless his heart, wanted the RCAF to form their own Canadian squadrons overseas and contribute as Canadian entities under the overall umbrella of the Royal Air Force. So as in all things, compromise was achieved. And with that, these RCAF squadrons being formed overseas, the very first squadrons were the only non-RAF bomber group, 6 group, was formed in late 1942. And then, of course, combat operations with 6 group started in January of 43. So let's go to the next slide. So the first Canadian bomber squadrons, there was these groups, and you see how it evolves from 405, the very first one that became a Pathfinder squadron for almost the entire war, quite an esteemed position within Bomber Command is the Pathfinders. And then these are all the other 400 series squadrons, which are Royal Canadian Air Force in nature. And you can see November, the last one, 431, is formed in November 42. And that is when the final paperwork had been drawn up for RCAF 6 group to form, the Canadian group to be part of the British Bomber Command. So let's go to the next slide. So 6 group being formed in late 42, 4 RCAF squadrons were added very quickly after that, I should say 3 of them. And then finally, 415 squadron joined, coming from Coastal Command and being switched over to Bomber Command in July of 1944. And remember, all of the 6 group squadrons were based in Yorkshire, in the northern part. And then, of course, RAF 4 group was in the south part of Yorkshire. So that's where all these young airmen squadrons, and for those of you that perhaps maybe don't understand, a squadron could be anywhere from 18 to 24 heavy bombers. And at each, at least at the Canadian bomber bases, there were 2 squadrons at every bomber base, 2 Canadian squadrons. And if you can imagine a squadron, and it's over 1,000 airmen, ground crew, supervisory crew. So each squadron had over 1,000 RCAF air crew, and some RAF air crew were interspersed in there with the Canadian squadrons. So that's the background behind 6 groups. So 14 squadrons grand total, and all these airmen in Yorkshire. And of course, they weren't flying every single day. So do you folks remember way back when you were 18, 19, 20, maybe 21, and you had free time and too much energy on your hands? And so Yorkshire was their playground. And I'm sure there was many twinkles in many eyes as these young men sacrificed their lives, but they had fun on the side because they knew that life might be short. So let's go to the next slide. So RCAF 6 group from all of 1943, 1944, and those last months of early 45. Look at how much of 6 group combat ops were flown by the Halifax. 70%. 7 out of every 10 bomber ops flown by RCAF 6 group was that. And at the end of the war, they had switched over to the Lancaster. And there's a major reason for why they didn't get Lancasters and they were given Halifaxes. And I'm going to show it to you. And then, of course, the initial history of RCAF 6 Group. The trusty old Wellington Wimpy bomber did the other 10% plus some others like Hamden's. But everything that I'm telling you here today, I can point you to the sources. And the one source for me, after 20 plus years of trying to find the best sources on Bomber Command, I find Martin Middlebrook's esteemed Bomber Command War Diaries to be the best. And then I've got supplementary references beyond that. But that's what we're looking at for RCAF 6 Group, which is one of 7 heavy bomber groups in all of Bomber Command. Now, remember, see, we're looking at RCAF use Halifax 70%, Lancaster 20%. In the British squadrons, if you had to pick an average for the entire bomber war, I would say you could easily reverse that and say Lancaster 70% and possibly Halifax 20% in the British RAF squadrons. But I haven't really dealt with that, so we can compare numbers later on. But for Canada, it's the Halifax. And there are misconceptions about the Halifax, and the items I'm going to tell you about today may swing you over to saying, wow, I didn't know that about the Halifax and what it means to the Canadians. So let's go on to the next slide. Now, there is a moment in time when RCAF 6 Group took a major step forward, and it's when this gentleman on the left, Air Vice Marshal Black Mike McEwen, MCDFC, Military Cross, Distinguished Flying Cross from World War I. He was a fighter pilot, ace in World War I. He shot down 27 enemy aircraft. He came up through the ranks of the RCAF in 1941-42, and then later on, as he moved overseas, he became, at the start of 1944, the commanding officer of RCAF 6 Group. And so Air Vice Marshal Brooks started off 6 Group, but this great man, Air Vice Marshal McEwen, he's the one that transformed the RCAF 6 Group into what it became by the end of the war. He was a bit of a slave driver, but it was for the reason of crews being efficient and surviving. And so I can't say enough about Black Mike McEwen and his leadership of 6 Group. So let's go on to the next slide.
That may be beyond my abilities at the
now here's another part of the poem, and I'll just read it to you now. If your best garden stuff is gone, that might for you a prize have won, you needn't blame it on your son. Blame the Canadians. If your daughter's best liked beau is snubbed and just told to go, don't say nothing. You just know. Blame the Canadians. If the blight is on your crop, the rainy weather will not stop. Or that birth rate's going up. Blame the Canadians. And, you know, if you think about these young lads defending our freedom and what they had to go through to survive a combat tour.
I'm not sure I understand.
And the risks and the hazards they took as bomber crew. And of course, you all know this, that out of about 100 bomber crews that started out perhaps to do a combat tour of 30 ops, maybe a few more, that only 1 in 4 finished their combat tour, that 3 out of 4 did not finish. And the way I understand it is 50% roughly were killed in action outright of those bomber crews, 50% casualty rate, and about 12% were killed or injured in training, and 13%, I don't know how you could call them lucky, but 13% were lucky and were shot down in their bombers and became prisoners of war for the duration of the war. So those are things that amazed me and have my utmost respect. And it's tough to fight a war when you're only 20 or 21 or 22. You've got the whole weight of the free world on your shoulders, and they did not blink, they did not shirk. So they're my heroes, and I hope they're yours. But remember, when they have free time, these things did happen. So let's, Claire, let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to start zooming in on Duisburg, and the RCAF 6 group flew the most sorties to a single target. That is Duisburg, and they did 1,312 aircraft over many ops to Duisburg. So obviously, Canada fits into almost every op bombing Duisburg during the entire war. And there you can see the tonnage, how many tons, that's like almost 10 million pounds of high explosive dropped on Duisburg. And now let's get into the record for RCAF 6 group as part of Bomber Command. If they got every single airplane ready and they had every crew ready to launch in all of their 14 squadrons, the Royal Canadian Air Force launched to Dortmund 293 bombers on the night of October the 6th. So not a bad record for 6 group, I guess you could say, for a one-day effort. That is their best effort. And then 6 group, RCAF 6 group, to Essen, again in October 1944. This is becoming the pinnacle of Bomber Command's operations. 6 group sent out 261 bombers on the night of October 23rd, returning on the morning of October 24th. And number 3 is Duisburg, of course, and hang on a second. Got distracted there. Duisburg on the night of, the morning of October 14th, they sent out 253 bombers, and 250 bombers, I'm sorry. But there's more on October 14, 15. So let's go to the next slide, Claire, and we'll show more data. So what is Operation Hurricane to Duisburg? It's a joint RAF and United States Army Air Force operation in October 44 to demonstrate to the enemy in Germany the overwhelming superiority of the Allied air forces in the theater. So if we break it down, so on the morning of October 14th, 1944, the RAF sent a grand total of 1,013 aircraft to bomb Duisburg. And unfortunately, they lost 14 aircraft, but that's very low amount, just a little over 1%. But look again, later the same day, during the evening of the 14th of October, going into the 15th, a further 1,005 RAF bombers came over Duisburg and dropped another thousands of tons of explosive. And unfortunately, Bomber Command lost 7 aircraft, which, as you know, there's 7 crew in each of the aircraft. So you see, you've got 1,013 in the morning, and the same squadrons, the same crews, the same airplanes went out again on the evening of the 14th, another 1,000. So you see how this is an unusual bomber ops within a 24-hour period. And I was just amazed when I saw that years ago, and it always stuck in my mind of how could they do this? A double op in one day. Because if you read the explanations of the what it takes to set up a bombing raid, there you go. So let's go to the next slide. Now, I spelt it right. I spelt Duisburg with a U. Somebody at 427 has put in Duisburg with an E. So that's not me, okay? But I did like this map because it shows the routing from Yorkshire. You can see Leeming is one of the bases there, and that's 427 bomber base, 427 squadron. And that's the basic outbound track to get to Duisburg, and the return track coming back. And you all know the hazards of night fighters, flak, and the massive defenses that the Nazis had for the bombers. But if you really think about it, Bomber Command figured in to every Allied victory in World War II. And if I can add to that, and Claire and I talked about this, D-Day on June 6, 1944, did you know that Bomber Command hammered the Nazi defenses all over the French coast for 3 months, ever before D-Day started? And they cut the railway lines, and they cut the bridges, and they bombed the battlements on the coastline with their bombers. And then, of course, they had some stealth squadrons to confuse the radar of the Nazis. And then D-Day became a success because the Nazis could not reinforce Normandy after the Allies hit the beaches. So you see how you could say D-Day is Army, but it's not. It's Bomber Command pounding the heck out of the Nazis. I could use vernacular, but I better not. Claire told me this is a wonderful venue and I shouldn't swear, okay? So I won't. But what I'm getting at is D-Day and Bomber Command, they're interconnected. So just a little aside there on that one. So Claire, let's go to the next slide. So I want to try and give you the degree of contribution of the RCAF and the Canadians to Operation Hurricane. You see the grand total of 2018 bombers went out in one 24-hour period on October 14th. Operation Hurricane. And those are quotation marks, RAF bombers. Now, here's where I need you folks to understand this. And those of you in the UK, I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm saying. But I've heard it said before by certain British people that they're so pleased that Canada could do their bit in World War II. Well, I need to give you some more numbers so you can see what that bit is. And I've used as many of the pages of data of the Bomber Command War Diaries as I could, and I've compared the overall RAF force with what was the Canadian contingent within that. So here we are, 2018 bombers by RAF Bomber Command. In fact, the RCAF contribution of those bombers, if you take the first daylight raid, the RCAF contributed 258 bombers, of which, you got to look down a little bit, 84% of RCAF 6 group aircraft were Halifaxes, and only 16% were Lancasters. That's on the Canadian side. Then you must add the night raid that starts on October 14th, RCAF 6 group. They put up another 239 bombers and the same ratio of Halifax to Lanc within 6 group. And just as an aside, the other Pathfinder squadron that was in, I believe it's 1 group, if somebody can double check me on that, RCAF 405 Pathfinder Squadron, they put up 28 bombers, and those were Lancs. But let's look at the grand total for that 24-hour period when 2018 bombers went out, and 525 of those bombers of the 2,000 were Canadian squadrons. So that works out to 26%. Okay, so if we could keep that in mind, 26% of a 2,000 bomber raid, certainly a good contribution. But now we have to add on to the 26%. So I need you to understand the next page, and we'll go here to the next page, Claire, sorry. Okay, so we know that the RAF's bomber squadrons, not the Canadians, on Duisburg, it's 2008 subtract 525. So the other squadrons were RAF bomber squadron aircraft, and that becomes, okay, yeah. Somebody, Brian Samuels said Pathfinder force was 8 group. So I stand corrected. 405 Squadron RCAF was in 8 group, the only Canadian Pathfinder group in 8 group. So we have 1,483 British bombers from British squadrons. Now, I've gathered my data from the International Bomber Command Center, and I wanted you to look at what was the Canadian portion in the British squadrons. How many Canadians served, were seconded to the British squadrons? So there would be Canadians on board those 1,483 British RAF bombers. And I gathered the data that said the RCAF crew content in RAF bomber crews was 12%. And at one point in the war, the highest average content in a British RAF squadron aircraft, a crew, was 18%. So I felt that it would be fairly easy for me to build up an average and say the average crew content in a British bomber crew that was Canadian was 15%. This is not my figures. This is what you see there. And I have some documentation to prove it, but at least I had something to work with as I built up this review to you. So bottom line is 1 in 7 aircrew in a British RAF bomber was a Royal Canadian Air Force airman. So that's something to remember. Now, if we go to the next slide, Claire, you've got to follow me on this, but I just wanted to get it straight in my head, and I hope it makes sense to you. So if you had one RCAF crew member in every one of those 1,483 British bombers, and that's 15%, I equivocated that to 222 bombers out of the 1,483. If you took those Canadians in the British squadrons out of those crews, then that would be around 220 aircraft, possibly less, in that big formation that went to Duisburg out of the 2018. Then, as you can see down there where it says 747, so if the RCAF squadrons contributed 525, and then they had enough Canadian aircrew in British squadrons that were 200 plus, then you could directly correlate RCAF adding on to the bomber force, which could be 747 bombers on that one day in October 1944, when Canada's contribution was described to you. And I'm sure we will have wonderful debate on just how much percentage the RCAF contributed to the Duisburg raid, but I'm placing it nominally, easy for you to say, at 37% of the Duisburg raid on October 14, 15. And I guess we could go to the next slide. And you've got to understand where Canada stands in the world during World War II. And if you see the UK population of Commonwealth nations, the UK population was 71% of the Commonwealth, or the British Empire, whichever phrase suits your purpose. And Canada only had 11.5 million people in the Commonwealth nations during World War II. And then Australia is next at 7 million, New Zealand, and then, of course, we've got South Africa. And sorry, I think I missed out on South Africa, but so there's your grand total. And Canada only had 17% of the population of that greater Commonwealth population. And yet, how could Canada come up with 30%, 30+% of the aircrew for a bomber force? So that must mean something about they were keen to help, and they, as far as I can see, it is one of the high points in Canadian history, is how many people served in World War II. And I don't want you guys to be thinking that this is an American show or some other Russian show or something like that. It's just that I get the impression that Canada is an add-on, and it is mentioned in footnotes, and it is mentioned here and there, but I needed you to understand that it was a good effort, and I hope you will understand a little better when we're finished the show. And just a couple of more points, and then I wanted to tell you about our Halifax bomber rebuild that we're going ahead with. But Claire, let's go to the next slide. So, food for thought. For those of you who still wonder about Canada's stunning RCAF contribution in World War II, if the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan trained over 131,000 aircrew in Canada, mainly those aircrew trained for bombers, that 131,000 includes over 40,000 British, I think 10,000 Australians, and about 5,000 New Zealand crews. Think about this. How many of those British, Aussie, and Kiwi aircrew, I hope they don't mind me saying that, the New Zealander aircrew, how many of those trained in Canada were manning those 2008 heavy bomber aircraft that launched for Duisburg on the greatest raid in all of World War II? I bet you could go to any bomber crew that launched on October 14th, 1944, and say, where were you lads trained? And I bet you that more than one or two would say, oh yeah, I trained in Moose Jaw, or I trained in Claresholm, Alberta, or I trained in Brantford, Ontario. So, you know, there's a lot of interconnect there between our bomber crews and Canada. And it really is significant that all of these connections come together, and that Bomber Command, being what a huge force it was, what they did in World War II. And probably, you know how it would be, Army experts might not say that Bomber Command helped D-Day, or the Navy guys might say Bomber Command didn't help us sink German ships. But now, have any of you studied how many sea mines were dropped in the German shipping lanes by Bomber Command aircraft, and then totaled up the tonnage of German Nazi shipping that was sunk by sea mines and curtailed their operations? So I'm just, I know I'm biased and these things, but I am quite a student of World War II as a whole. But then when I see Bomber Command, I say, wow, these guys really influenced the outcome of the war. And, you know, as Churchill said, the bombers are our means to salvation. So I guess we're getting near the end of the program, the official program that Claire has set up for us. And Claire, let's go to the next slide. And I like this. This is a group of Canadians working at RCAF headquarters, young people from all walks of life working together. And obviously you can see young and happy considering the situation. And, you know, air crew, ground crew, support crew, they did it all. And I liked it. It struck me. So I thought it would include that. And then let's go to the next slide. And I just wanted to include this. This is data from the International Bomber Command Center about the RAF groups. And then it applies to who were RCAF crew and who were non-RCAF, like Royal Air Force or Royal Australian Air Force. So there's your data upon which I laid out the data of the Canadian participation in British RAF squadrons. And so I guess that's our basic program for today. And we've got about 10 more minutes till we're on the hour. And I'll try and go through this fairly fast. But you can see, for me as a Canadian historian, Canadian professional pilot, whose heroes were Bomber Command, and these Royal Canadian Air Force veterans that I knew for so many years, and you know that there's less than 1% of them still alive. The best tribute I could think of was I formed my group called Halifax 57 Rescue. And then I strong-armed I shouldn't say that. I convinced the Bomber Command Museum of Canada out near Calgary, Alberta, who have a beautiful running Lancaster as a tribute to our bomber crews. I convinced them they should have a Halifax. And you know that I've recovered 3 Halifaxes in the last 25, 27 years. And now we're doing another one. So Claire, let's go to the next slide about, this is our tribute to our Halifax crews so that we can pay them, give them the justice they deserve. And if you were a Canadian museum with a Lancaster, what do you need sitting beside the Lancaster? Is a Halifax. So here's the center section of a Halifax. You see, that is the 29-foot section of a rebuilt center section we got from a scrapyard in Malta. And you see the other piece of center section way in the back. And that's what we're building in Arnprior, Ontario. And as we get each big section of Halifax built, we will send it out in trucks. For our British folks, it's lorries. We will send them out to these sections out to Nanton, Alberta, and we will assemble it beside our Lancaster. So that's the core of the Halifax. It's almost done now. And Claire, let's go to the next slide. And I went to the Yorkshire Air Museum and we struck a deal. And the outer wing panel of a Hastings transport from the 1950s is almost identical to the Halifax outer wing panel. So we struck a deal, and earlier this summer, we were able to acquire this outer wing panel, 25 feet by 11 feet by 6 feet. and it's now in our possession. And bless the Royal Canadian Air Force, they're going to lift it across the ocean in a C-17 and take it to our rebuild shop. So, folks, we're serious. We're, I don't know, for you North Americans, you know the song. Maybe you British folks don't know it, but it's our theme song. It's called Johnny Cash Singing One Piece at a Time. So we are gathering everything from around the world to make a Halifax. We've got 10 engines. We've got 14 propeller blades. We've got all kinds of things. So let me just show you the final slide. And Claire, let's go to the cutaway. Here's a Halifax Mark VI. It's the best of the Halifaxes with fuel-injected Bristol Hercules engines, not carbureted, fuel-injected, 1,800 horsepower per engine. And everything in green you see we have already for our Halifax rebuild at the Bomber Command Museum. So we're serious. We're going around the world. We're finding everything. Folks, you don't know the half of what we've got planned for Halifaxes in the future, but I hope you will follow us. I hope you would even consider supporting us. And Claire has put on our website for support if you'd like. If you know any corporations who believe in their Bomber Command veterans and our freedom, then we sure would appreciate it if you could send us along that support or that information about them. And the Bomber boys are our heroes. They sacrificed everything for us, and we all must save the history and give them the honor and the respect they deserve. So, Claire, that's the end of our show. And thank you so much for hosting this. And over to you. Did you want to come back in and be a moderator for any messages?
Sure. Thank you so much, Carol. That was amazing. I want to just first of all post some information into the chat box. I do have the website for the museum, and I've also got one for the Halifax Rescue. So let me just make sure that I get that done. I'm sure you will agree that it is an amazing project to contribute to, especially if you have affiliations or, you know, ancestors that served with Bomber Command as well. You know, it'll just be as important to you as it is to all of us. Just get that in as well. Too many buttons to press here.
Now, Claire, can we go over a little bit? I mean, like, what is it? It's 5 minutes to the hour now.
That's fine. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
So I note here that Steve has actually said, I take your point that Canada's contribution to the Allied victory overall was not insignificant, especially in that of Bomber Command. But you should be assured that all in the UK who have any insight into the contribution of all Allied nations understand Canada played a significant role. Totally agree. Totally agree. Yeah.
Good. Bless you. Bless you.
I think with the Canadians as well, I mean, certainly some of the crews that I've researched, you know, there was so many of them had ties anyway to UK. You know, some of them, their parents were British, Scottish, you know, Irish. So they have that affiliation with the UK and they feel part of it.
Yeah, you know, I bet you so many immigrated from the UK to Canada in the starting years of Canada that their roots go way back.
Yeah. Yep.
So that may be another familial reason why they felt that they must support.
Yeah.
And so now, I promised you I would tell you about Canada's vengeance weapon in World War II. Okay. And I was told a story by the navigator of a bomber crew, and I have adapted it to tell you the story. Is Bill Riome was an air gunner in a Canadian squadron in Yorkshire, and he was good at playing cards and poker, and Bill was playing cards one night, and he got way ahead of the entire crowd on money, and this guy owed him money and he couldn't pay him. And he said, okay, I'll give you my 1923 BSA motorcycle for what I owe you. And Bill said yes. Now, you got to understand, this is all in context of Canada building a vengeance weapon to attack Germany. So Bill Riome, he loved his motorcycle. He would race with his buddy on another motorcycle to the pubs all over Yorkshire. And of course, he only stole a little bit of 100 octane gas out of the bombers to fuel his motorcycle. But they would race to these pubs and then they would race back. And one night, Bill was coming back from the pub, and you can't run 100 octane in an old 1920s motorcycle without repercussions. And Bill's motorcycle, his BSA motorcycle, seized up solid, it was toasted forever. You were never going to fix it. So he got towed back to the bomber base. And so because Bill was so disappointed he'd lost this ground transport, which is very rare for a bomber crew guy to have his own wheels. And he was so pissed off, excuse my French, that he talked to the armorers, and they loaded his dead BSA up into the bomb bay of the Halifax, and they took it out that night and dropped it out over Berlin. And that is Canada's vengeance weapon against the Nazis.
Great story. Brilliant story.
So, but you can look him up, Bill Riome, air gunner, Royal Canadian Air Force. Yeah. But okay, is there any? Do we have?
Caroline has said, of course, there were also many Canadians who came over to the UK at the beginning of the war or before, who trained and joined the RAF.
Yes, there. You could have that. Then, in fact, the RAF did a big recruiting program in Canada in the 1936-37 era. Mm-hmm. And Canadians were able to join the Royal Air Force straight across. And those guys that joined the RAF that were Canadian, by the time the war started, they were combat veterans in the Royal Air Force. So I haven't really included them in there, but I'm aware of them, and there's several hundred of them.
I mean, I just think your presentation, to actually pick one operation and drill down into all those facts, it's a bit of a minefield. I mean, that's a lot of data to go through, a lot of data to collect. I mean, how long did it take you to go through all of that, Carol? Years. Yeah.
I had to absorb it, and then I had to say, my goodness, even I didn't know that, but the revelation from the very beginning was, you mean you guys in the Canadian squadrons flew the Halifax? Mm-hmm. I thought I was like every tourista on the street. I thought they all flew Lancasters the entire war, but not the Canadians. And if I can, I'll read you this just quickly so you guys can do this. Why did the Canadians get the Halifax? And there's a political reason for it. Okay. In September 1942, Harris wrote to Portal, Chief of the Air Force, the Royal Air Force, I failed to see why we should give these people, Canadians, who are determined to huddle in a corner by themselves. That's the 6 group element, right? Canadians wanted their own group. They are determined to huddle in a corner by themselves on purely political grounds. The best equipment, Lancaster aircraft, at the expense of British and other Dominion crews. So you see what that means? That means that the Halifaxes were directed to the Canadians in 6 Group because 6 Group wanted to be separate an RCAF group.
Yeah.
And Harris was true to his word. And for the majority of the number 6 RCAF group aircrew, the Halifax bomber became their dominant aircraft, which they flew through the toughest days and costliest period of World War II. And that is from Reap the Whirlwind, a very good book published in 1991. So there is a connection between Halifax 6 Group and why they got the Halifax. So just a little aside.
No, that's really interesting. I mean, I think as well, it just makes me think, you know, if there's perhaps a particular operation that does interest you, it would be really interesting to take more of a deep dive into the whole thing, into it as a whole, and look at, you know, all the squadrons that were taking part, not just the crew that you were actually researching or the interest that you had. Yeah, it's given me a new angle and a way of looking at things, I think, Carol. Yeah,
and you know, you've done a lot of work on 102 Ceylon Squadron. Yeah. And so you can't super differentiate between a British squadron and a Canadian squadron. They all went to the same targets. They all followed the same routes. They all had the same hazards, and they have my utmost respect. I flew 20,000 hours on jets during my 30 plus years of commercial flying. And it's tough enough to fly an airplane, a big airplane, and without somebody shooting at you.
Yeah.
And so they have my utmost respect, and they're just young guys that saved us.
Yeah, definitely. Does anyone else have any questions? You can unmute yourself if you would prefer. No? I think you've explained everything so well.
Well, you know, and it's been a lot of fun, and I'm always learning new things every time. And I love to. Here's what happens is a young airman comes home to his home, and he won't talk about his 30 plus missions that he survived because it's so tough on him. So then I've done hundreds of these. My Uncle Bill was in bombers, and he wouldn't talk about it after the war. And we don't know what he did. All we know he was in Halifax's or he was in Lancasters. And when you hand them Uncle Bill's combat career, it's like treasure.
Yeah.
So that's why we do it.
Yeah. And I mean, we had a separate conversation as well. I mean, the Canadian service records in comparison to the British are just so jam-packed full of information. So I mean, I always say to people, if you're researching a crew and you've got, you know, a guy from the RAF and they've got Canadians in amongst them, look at their service records as well, because often there will be documentation within that tells you more about the events, you know, if they were shot down, the circumstances relating to that loss.
Sure. And remember now, if a British crew gets in trouble, all you got to do is turn and point and blame the Canadian, okay?
And you know, I think actually what I need to do is the next time that I go to Pocklington for one of the squadron reunions is try and find a Yorkshireman that can record that poem for you.
Yeah, because by gum, I can't do it. Okay, I can't do that. While I went to store, you know, I mean, I can't do a Yorkshire accent, but I wanted to because you can see a Yorkshireman saying that.
So if anybody is from Yorkshire and they're prepared to record this, give me a shout and we can set it up and pass it on to Carol.
Sure. Yeah. Send it to me too, because I can't do the E by gums. Okay.
you can use it for your future presentations then. So thank you so much for your presentation, Carol. It's been really interesting, and it's gave me a bit of inspiration for digging a bit deeper into certain operations. It really is like taking on a massive project, so to speak. So
Oh yeah, no, I would prefer to work on Halifax's, but I got to save the history too.
Yeah.
So, but thank you, Claire, and thanks for everybody joining in. And contact me at Bomber Command Museum of Canada and Halifax 57 Rescue, and let's get her done.
Yeah, and keep updating us about how the project's going in the Allied Air Force Research Facebook group. And yeah, we're always happy to have you back again once things are progressing with the project as well.
Great. Okay, well, thanks very much. And we learned some more history today.
Yeah. So before we finish up, the next webinar is on Wednesday, the 25th of October at 7 p.m. The presentation will be provided by 3 members of the 102 Squadron Association Management Group, which includes myself as the archivist. The presentation title is A Personal Perspective on the Formation, Development and Continuation of a World War II Bomber Command Squadron Association. Something that's kind of few and far between. There's not that many squadron associations out there now. You can register for this webinar, and let me just place the details into the chat box. There we go. As you know, we do have an amazing relationship with Pen and Sword Books, and I am interviewing some of their aviation authors. They stock an amazing range of aviation books, and I have already posted a link into the chat box where you can go and check these out for yourself. If you're on Facebook, check out the Allied Air Force Research Group. It's an amazing place to chat about what you're researching, get second opinions, and also meet like-minded people, and a link has been posted into the chat box for that as well. So that just leaves us to say goodbye. So thank you again, Carol, and I hope to catch up with you again soon.
Okay, bye everybody.
Okay, see you all next month.
Bye-bye.
Bye.